Welcome in from your SUV, from your tractor or your ute, or maybe you're even riding your electric motorbike. But from wherever you are, you're with Alistair Moorhead and Glenn Judson, and this is the Al and Juddy Show. Well, what we want to do is reach out and provide you some technical information on a range of agricultural topics which may interest you, but to do it in a different way. Casual and comfortable format that allows you to listen where you want and when you want. This is intended for general information, and for more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep. Al, just give me a bit of background on you. How long have you been in this industry, and what do you actually do as a job?
Juddy, I think it's probably wise to start at the beginning, actually, because that probably gives a few people a bit of an idea of where it all comes from. But I started uni at Lincoln College in 1989, and I happened to meet one Glenn Judson doing an ag sci at the same time. So we started at Lincoln College in 89 doing a Bachelor of Agricultural Science at the time. And pretty early on in the piece, we both identified each other as kindred spirits for no other reason as that we have pretty warped sense of humour, and both of us are pretty competitive. So we did a lot of training together, even though I played hockey and Juddy played rugby. So that's pretty much how that started. We got through our degrees, and I started a master's in ag sci in about 93-ish, I think. And unless I'm mistaken, Juddy, did you start your PhD straight away, or did you start working?
A year after you. You're ahead of me.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's probably good to point out that you were very much focused on the plant science side of things, which was really only a solution to what I was studying, which was the animal side of things.
True.
So we do come from a slightly different viewpoint.
We did have a couple of crossover moments, though. We had a bleed sheep and do copper samples on stags and things like that. Yep. So it wasn't all just the plant-based stuff. But we did separate into plants and animals at uni. And then I did a master's in ag sci, which took 2.5 years. I might have paid a bit of pull at the time to stretch that out a little bit. But I then started to wait for my colleague to finish his PhD before I graduated. And so it might have taken another 5 years for me to graduate after I started work, waiting for a certain Glenn Judson to finish his PhD. And I started in the commercial sector straight out of uni in 2005 for a company called Hodder & Tolley. Travelled around the South Island as a territory manager. Pretty much you'd describe it as a sales agronomist. And did the whole of the South Island. That was a pretty extensive job, and probably started that pathway of seeing a lot of environments, a lot of landscapes, travelling from the south coast of Invercargill to Golden Bay and all the areas in between. So it was a really amazing way to start a career to see that far. It was a very intense job at the time, travelling that sort of distance though. So yeah, that's how I kicked off.
And you would have seen a lot of different farm systems as well as environments, everything from
a lot of
deer.
Farm change. Yep. Yeah, a lot of farm change through the 90s particularly. You know, I was pretty much watching Southland convert out of sheep into dairy on the first wave of conversions in the mid-90s, and then obviously likewise the second in the early 2000s. People tend to forget how tough the sheep environment was in the 2000s and how that became a natural path to the dairy conversion in Southland in that age. So we saw a lot of that happening and changing, and so watching land use change was pretty big part of the start of my career. And then I went on into PGG Seeds, where I worked there for about 6 to 7 years before we crossed paths again, and we'll come back to that interaction. And then I moved into the merged entity of PGG Rights and Seeds, and the brand Agricom was the natural process of the merger of Agricom, a company founded out of Ashburton, and the PGG Rights, PGG Seeds business. And I've been in the business now for about 25 years. Now, yeah, your
so
path.
well actually my good friend Alistair Moorhead was doing his masters. I was at then it was Lincoln University that had changed to, and I started a PhD there, looking actually at deer production, looking at how red deer and the Wapiti cross differed in terms of the productivity out of a farm system. So after completing that, I then went to a group in South Canterbury called Deermaster, and they were a group of farmers who were collecting a whole lot of on-farm information, and they needed someone to make some sense of that information and produce some written material in terms of how you could improve productivity on deer farms. And one of the projects that we actually ran there was the requirement of trying to generate some lactation feed in what was then quite dry East Coast environment. So I turned to my very good friend in PGG Seeds at the time, Alistair Moorhead, and said, can you find me a solution to this animal quandary? We've got lactating hinds and we've got no feed, and how are we going to generate that? So I guess that's we sort of came back together and worked on that particular program very successfully, actually. We're able to generate some massive differences using some summer cropping relative to the resident brown grass that we were dealing with. So since then, joined PGG Seeds in the capacity of a animal nutritionist, and then have moved, as there's been mergers over time, into what now is the Agricom business, and very much look at the provision of crops and grazing pastures from an animal point of view. So that's kind of where I kind of fit into the business.
Absolutely, and to be fair, it's been a really productive and stimulating sort of relationship, because we have come at very similar topics from two very different areas, and it's actually probably where the magic probably has occurred in our careers from that perspective. In that time, both of us have travelled a lot. We haven't travelled as much together as I'd have liked, but all through the eastern seaboard of Australia. I've been to South America for a number of trips. You've done your time?
Yeah, I've done Australia as well, but then into Europe, and particularly in Ireland, looking at some of the differences that are faced in Ireland relative to New Zealand from both a agronomic point of view, but also an animal systems point of view. So we've got that experience in terms of a lot of diverse farming systems, if you like, and the impact of forages on that. Which brings me to our subject for the day, which is essentially on white clover, but it's in the context of the fact that under our new nitrogen limits, we are going to have to still be productive. And I guess that there's an opportunity here to look at white clover and what that might bring to this set of challenges. So what is white clover, Al? Can you give me a broad brush background of what white clover is?
Well, Glenn, the thing about white clover is Trifolium repens, so that's white clover. But what it actually is for us is it's a temperate legume that fits extremely well into our landscape, particularly one that is fertilised and, as I described, predominantly in a temperate landscape. It is a clover that is naturally found in grazing systems, and it's typically followed animals all around the globe. It's one of those plants that moves in those sort of landscapes, in those climatic zones, and colonises grass landscapes where there is fertility, moisture, and not too hot and not too dry. So yeah, that's white clover, and it has found a very special place in New Zealand. We're one of the biggest users of white clover in the world, particularly in grazing systems, and it has a very strong fit. It would be described pretty much as our secret efficiency that you tend to find from the New Zealand farming system, is utilising the special powers of white clover in our day jobs, if you'd like to say.
So when we talk about white clover and adding it to a mix, what are the common reasons that a farmer would use would cite in terms of putting white clover into a mix?
Well, in the past, I would have given predominantly 3 to 4 reasons, and the reasons would, for me personally, sit in this order in the past. The first reason is that animal performance is optimised, if not maximised, by having a good content of white clover in pasture. And the literature on the impacts of white clover on live weight gain and milk production is quite conclusive across decades of research. Yeah, so I'd put that as number one, though, Juddy. That's the point, is that Why would you use white clover in a pasture? Because it makes a difference to animals' performance, both young animals, older animals, and lactating animals. So white clover is special from an animal production perspective. The second reason relates to both pasture management and obviously animal productivity. But having white clover present in pasture improves the average farmer's ability to manage residuals in an effective way. It improves palatability and it improves the ability of animals to graze and hit your target residuals without you having to exercise other management. So if you get a critical amount of white clover in your pasture, the whole grazing management of pasture is so much easier.
So probably maybe less likely to have to top because you've got some white clover there and you've got good grazing management. Yep. Excellent.
And the third reason was very much because white clover has a relationship with a bacteria called rhizobia, which is capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen and providing white clover with that. And in doing that, it actually feeds the system both through the animal and the soil with literally atmospheric nitrogen or free nitrogen. So that is a pretty powerful mechanism for the plant to excel in a grassland where grass is hungry for nitrogen and the landscape is hungry for nitrogen, and I'm a plant that comes with my whole packed lunch full of nitrogen. So that gives white clover a universal advantage in low nitrogen environments.
And you said that's third, but I guess in some of the environments that we're seeing, regulatory environments, we're seeing that probably priority is coming up the order.
I think it's been turned on its head. We're looking at a different set of circumstances now where our farming community's been reviewed on, and external influences are obviously having drivers on the fact that we need as a country to stay productive because that's attractive to the country, and our farming community does an awesome effort at making our country a productive environment for producing outstanding nutritional products. But the reality is that is coming with a lot more scrutiny on the way we're achieving that. And elevated inputs is not necessarily the flavour of the environment we're in at the moment. So what I did point out at the start, there's a couple of key drivers to the start of this conversation, is that very much when you're looking at clover, it is still a medium to high fertility plant. So it needs a base level of fertility to actually perform. But when it's in a healthy and growing state, it's capable of fixing a really significant amount of nitrogen for free, as we've just discussed. And that's what's making the difference at the moment. As our natural nitrogen levels drop in the landscape, white clover is able to get all the advantages and slowly get stronger and stronger and fill in some of the gaps to the productivity we're losing for the reduction of nitrogen in our landscape.
There are in terms of different types, so different types of white clover, and in saying that, can we talk about a little bit about where you might use those?
Well, first things first, white clover is trifolium repens, so it's all white clover, but in the broader and more general sense, yes, there are different types.
Well, can I just jump in there? Have you heard about the new clover that only grows on Saturdays and Sundays?
No, Juddy, I haven't heard of the new clover.
It's called trifolium weekends.
Sorry, that is just shocking. So we'll put that one to bed and move on. So yes, there are different styles of clover and white clover, and historically, and I think today it's still currently appropriate, that they can be banded into three broad categories. And you tend to have what is described as a small to medium leaf size, and that reflects plants that are ecotypes from more intensively grazed environments, and you tend to find leaf size tends to get smaller and smaller with more and more intensive grazing.
And that's probably because that plant's trying to avoid grazing by smaller leaves and getting closer to the ground.
Correct, and ends up with more light and more space, and it's getting pinned to the ground, and so it can't express itself to its full potential all the time. The next description would be a sort of like a medium to large leaf size, and these are starting to get quite big. And I think the word that you're probably going to come out with is that they have a lot of plasticity. They can be pinned down and they can be a lot more closer to a medium leaf size under drier conditions, less fertile conditions with more intensive grazing. But given a longer rotation with a bit of moisture and a bit of fertility, they can actually get really quite large. So the medium large types tend to be the most plastic, and they do move from being medium to large depending on the environment they're in. And then you get the large leaf types, and these types tend to excel where fertility is high, moisture is consistent, warm environments, and you tend to find these ones compete with vigorous grass strongly. They're quite upright, they're quite large, and they really fight for their space in pasture that is really productive. So the large leaf types are very impressive. They can get to the size of the palm of your hand quite successfully. And those three categories are also quite closely linked to stolon density. You tend to find the finest stolons in diameter with the most branches and the most spreading across the ground are found in the medium, small to medium types. And as you get bigger and bigger in leaf size, you tend to find the diameter of the stolons get bigger and bigger and fewer and fewer. So there's a relationship between stolon size, shape, and density and leaf size.
So if you were in a sheep production system, for example, and this was feed for ewes, for example, you might drift to the smaller leaf size and trying to get some persistency out of that. If you're in a finishing system, maybe with deer or cattle, you might be drifting to the higher leaf size.
That's right.
In terms of the farming
That's
systems.
Exactly right. And you tend to find the one in the middle sits inside that mixture as well on either way.
That can move,
yeah,
depending on the environment.
That's right.
So we've talked a lot about this nitrogen fixing, and it's becoming really important because it is becoming a really important source of nitrogen, given that some of the limits that we're under. Let's talk a little bit. What we're breathing in here is about 78% nitrogen, and the nitrogen is fixing that. Can you give us a bit of a high level description of what that fixation actually is?
The Clover is fixing.
The fixing, yeah. So give me just a layperson's description of that.
Yeah. So there's definitely some literature and equations that highlight that for every kilogram of dry matter a clover plant produces, you're getting about 28 grams of nitrogen fixed that is going through the plant and is accessible to the animal. So the 28 to 30 grams of fixed nitrogen is again cycling in the green leaves of clover, passing through the animal, being partitioned into meat or milk, and then being mostly urinated out onto the pasture. And that is the cycling created by the animal. There's about a similar amount that's occurring with the breakdown of roots, particularly the fine root hairs, the nodules that sit on the fine root hairs. They break down predominantly in the winter and the summer. And when they mineralize on the rising soil temperatures, when the microbial life starts to kick off in the warmer times of the spring and the autumn, they are strongly responsible for the big spike you get in early spring growth, and likewise the little spike you get in autumn growth. As you come out of the dry, you hit some rainfall, you got mushroom season, and you tend to find that little punch of growth you get into April nationally is the breaking down of summer root mass, and that's being converted into a more available nutrient. So the big point is the stuff that's breaking down in the roots isn't coming at you at a uniform amount at the same rate every day of every part of the year. They're predominantly feeding the spring flush and predominantly feeding the autumn flush.
And I guess the nitrogen that's coming through the cycling of the animal, that is coming on a relatively regular basis, but the problem is spatially it's not. And we're creating urine patches, and those urine patches are actually an important source of nitrogen loss from the system through leaching. So through overloading. So these two different ways of cycling nitrogen, one's through the animal, one's through the plant, and they are actually working at different times and in different ways.
Just interesting fact through all the work you're doing in this space, how, just for people to visualise, in this case of dairy cows, which is highly topical, how much of a landscape or a paddock does urinary nitrogen actually cover in a calendar year?
It's really interesting. With some of the grass pastures, that can be around the 25% mark.
So that's of a per hectare basis.
A per hectare basis. But it's really interesting in some of the mitigation options we've got in terms of ecotane, for example. We've managed to increase that because we've increased urine volume, and so we have more urinations per day, and that means that we're spread slightly more. Not a whole lot more, because we are getting some overlaps as well, but that certainly helps in terms of the area that we're covering. So if you think about in a year, you've got a hectare, about a quarter of that will be covered by urine patches over the number of grazers that we've got.
I suppose, talking about taking the piss and the role of urine in this case, the reality is this is what we still have to deal with as an industry. It's not perfect. So this cycling through the animal, one, it causes our problems, but the second thing is that it's very spatial, and farmers have always dealt with this, and that's why subdivisions played such a big role in the spatial distribution of, for example, phosphate out of dung, and dung particularly. But the same can be said for, in the ideal world, you'd ask all the animals just to spread it around uniformly, but it actually comes in patches, and the point is it's not the whole paddock. It is literally only empowering between 25 and, 30%?
Yeah, in that vicinity.
Yeah.
So I guess if we're talking about the animals in terms of performance, you mentioned earlier that there's a really good correlation between the amount of clover in a pasture and animal performance. I want to tease a little bit more of that out, because for quite some time we've known that it's almost a straight line relationship. The more clover you can get in there, the higher the performance of those animals. And so where we are driving for higher clover contents, we're expecting higher performance out of those animals. And there's a couple of reasons why that actually happens. So first of all, we're talking a little bit about intake-related issues here, and the fact that clovers tend to be the harvest dynamics, or the ease at which these animals consume it, is higher for clover, and that's because they've got leaves that are in the horizontal plane rather than grass that are in the kind of more in the vertical plane, and those are more easily harvested. Every mouthful, you've got more material going down their throat every bite, and therefore in a day they graze more. So it's much easier. And I think you and I have done some grazing demonstrations where we've got down on our hands and knees, and with our thumb and forefinger we've pretended to graze. And certainly pastures with high clover content are more easy to get more in your shopping bag, which is what we call the rumen, than those that are very ryegrass dominant. So and even more so for some of the herbs and brassicas, for example.
Would you describe that as grazability?
Yeah, grazability, harvesting dynamics. How easy is it for the animals to get
I think
intake?
We used to talk about a lot. These are all about factors affecting intake.
Yeah.
So the way you present pasture is one thing, but what the pasture's made up of has a big impact on it.
Absolutely. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and it's something that's not quite nearly as obvious, but it has quite a big impact here, is actually how long it takes for that material to pass out of the animal. So the passage rate.
Fractional degradation rate.
See,
I might be in a plant, but I still
remember
some animal
so
stuff.
The speed at which material that these animals consuming breaks down to a particle size that's allowed to leave the rumen distinguishes how quickly those animals will return to grazing. Fast passage rates, fast breakdown speeds will mean that those animals will return to grazing sooner because their rumen's emptied out. And so having clover in the as a proportion of the diet, a fast degradation rate in those animals will actually eat more in a day. And you see that in a lot of the work that's coming through, particularly around ecotane, for example, is you see that intake creeps up the more, so they're put all the feed in front of them, so they have to harvest it, but they're eating more simply because that passage rate is faster, is much faster.
One of the things about bringing more nitrogen into the plant means that our levels of crude protein are more consistently high, which is part of the secret of white clover. So you've mentioned the fractional degradation rate, the horizontal leaves from a harvest dynamic perspective, but just tease out the whole efficiency of protein found in clover versus found in grasses and other species?
So the way that nitrogen is stored in a clover is quite different to some of their other species, and I guess at opposite ends of the spectrum, we've got a clover that's fixing its own, and we have a lot of true protein. So that's actually processed quite differently in the animal compared to what we describe as non-protein nitrogen. So that's all the other nitrogen compounds that we call crude protein, but actually are very quickly mobilized in the rumen, and a lot of that ends up in urine. So these very quickly mobilized nitrogen compounds are sometimes lost to the system in urine. So actually having plants with true protein, because there's a breakdown step in the rumen, a lot of those actually escape the rumen and are absorbed further down the gut, and therefore we get a much higher uptake of protein in where we're dealing with true protein rather than these non-protein nitrogen compounds. So we actually get an increase in terms of the protein that the animal was able to use from things like white clover.
So the thing about this is that clover seems, obviously we want it, and I'll go back into its place in our production system and as we expand this out, but it sounds almost too good to be true. And when you tease out these things, there's always fish hooks. And so the one thing I would sort of dwell on, particularly with cattle, is that what are the sort of animal health issues that exist with white clover particularly?
So we've got this faster passage rate. We've got animals eating more, but we've also got we sort of get to the edge of having animals that are growing very fast, and then we run into some of these issues. And the first one, the most obvious one, is bloat, and that's where we've got this stable foam that forms in the rumen, and it stops the animal releasing gas through burping, and a lot of that's methane. And so where we get the reduction in terms of being able to get rid of that gas, essentially we blow up like a balloon, and so bloat is a real issue, and it's certainly at some times of the year more prevalent and worse, and so pastures with higher clover content are a danger at that period of time. The other thing is sometimes when we get climatic conditions, we've got moisture, and we've got cattle that maybe are hungry and eating lots very quickly, or where intake is actually going up and down quite a bit. It's not a stable changing over time, is where we start running into issues with bloat. Now, it doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't have clover pastures with lots of clover in them. What we need to be mindful is at those times that we need to be able to mitigate some of those risks, and the use of bloat oils, making sure that we've got animals that are well fed, keeping an eye on these animals and looking for issues.
Fibre?
Yep. So again, the double edge with the fibre, I guess, is that you're wanting these animals to eat lots and be very productive, but then you've sort of gone a little bit far.
Well, fibre sits at the other end of the fractional degradation rate, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because fundamentally it just fills the gut and sits there,
slows everything down,
and stops animals eating other things. And on average, most of our fibres are very low quality relative to a green pasture plant.
Yeah. The other thing that fibre does actually is increases the amount of chewing the animal does, and that's released in saliva, and saliva is a particularly good buffer. So that can be very useful when we've got issues of subclinical acidosis, for example. So we can fix some there.
Now, just out of interest, this is not just a problem of white clover, it's just that it's been associated with legumes. So I will ask the question, is there more than one form of bloat?
Yes, there is. There's so you've got what we call the frothy bloat, or the foam forming bloat, but we've also got what's termed feedlot bloat, which is essentially the fact that these gases aren't being expelled out of the rumen because we've got an acid environment. And so there's two different things here. Clover is normally associated with a frothy bloat, and as you rightfully say, it tends to be clover, but it can be all legumes. We've even seen bloat on Italian ryegrass, for example, in that really lush, fast-growing phase.
Middle of spring and possibly the end of autumn.
If we are trying to stretch the amount of clover we've got in our pasture, how would we set that up?
Yeah, I think the key really is there's a couple of low-hanging fruit here, and on the scale of it, it's about competition. It's getting your fertility regime right, and it's then about your establishment phase. And so typically the way we make our average pasture mix is about creating a mixture that can establish, perform, and meet a person's expectations 95% of the time. We in the industry don't necessarily want to have to hold every single paddock's hand of whether it gets going or not. But so typically we're using strong rates of ryegrass and normal and strong rates of white clover as our primary drivers. But the conflict in a normal pasture mix comes at your sowing time and the way you manage it through your first couple of grazings. So with sowing, it's all about sowing depth. And the reality is that we lose a lot of our efficiency of the amount of seed we put in the ground, the deeper we go with clover. And it's quite dramatic once you hit below about 1.5 centimetres. But as you approach 2 to 2.5 centimetres, you are only getting a fraction of the clover that you're actually delivering into your pasture mix. So the happy place and the sweet spot sits around 1 centimetre to almost the surface with white clover. It is actually one of the few plants that really excels by germinating on the surface as well. So strategies of sowing half your clover at about 1 centimetre to 1.5 centimetres, or to broadcast on the surface at the second half of your clover mix are really valid. But you've always got to keep in the back of your mind, it still needs space. So this is where you come, and I'm still sticking with a standard pasture mix. And what that space is created for, how the space is created initially is by how you handle your first grazing round. So the traditional technique for monitoring a pasture for when you can first do your first grazing is the pull test, where you take your thumb and forefinger, like you said before, and you go down your rows, and as long as you're not pulling out your plants as you're going, they're often in a state ready to be grazed. So the key here is about a farmer's approach to how he manages and utilises his young pasture. If I take the autumn sown East Coast dryland mentality, my autumn sown perennial pasture is quite often valuable winter feed. So I carry that forward as a perennial pasture to quite a high cover because I'm actually using that as winter feed. Now that's quite the opposite to establishing excellent clover, where really you're trying to keep the light coming into the base of that pasture. You're trying to keep light hitting the ground and around the clover growing points because that helps them create their stolons and their runners. And from that, you keep getting the spread of the white clover into all the gaps in your pastures. Basically, in the first 6 months, shade is your enemy to establishing good clover stands. So you can see there's a conflict regularly between a farmer wanting cover, wanting to transfer young pasture forward in a finishing role or a wintering role because they're vigorous young pastures. And because they allow them to build up, they create shade. And when they create shade, they're putting pressure on clover's ability to run and find space. So that's a normal pasture. Recommendations sit around sowing depth, being shallow sowing with some seed possibly being spread on the ground. Grazing to allow light into the pasture on a regular basis would be my 2 big drivers of keeping clover in a normal pasture. But if you came to me and said, how do I always get good clover in my pasture? I would then start to come down and break down your individual paddock circumstances and more than likely start reducing the grass content of your pastures. Probably keep your clover content the same, but try to mitigate the big shading events by putting less grass in. So that should send a signal to you. What I'm doing though is I'm taking early dry matter away from your system to artificially give that clover a chance to get ahead of the grass or keep up with the grass.
So in a farm system, if you were after finishing feed at the other end of the year, actually you're best to graze those early, keep the clover content there, because actually dry matter then is not what you're after. You're wanting that after. The other thing I was going to say, and this might explain why sometimes we hear about the fact that nitrogen kills clover. And I think some of the
nitrogen doesn't kill clover.
So some of the comments you made there were really interesting in terms of why, when we put on lots of nitrogen, don't we get lots of clover if it's not killing it?
Well, first things first, it may not kill it, but it makes it lazy. So that relationship with the bacteria and the nodulation and the conversion of free nitrogen from the atmosphere does decline, because as a plant, it works independently of its symbiotic relationship with rhizobia, and it will actively seek free nitrogen out of the soil to grow itself. So it doesn't just rely on the rhizobia relationship. That's its special power for a low nitrogen environment. But if you're feeding, you're starting to make the rhizobia lazy, and white clover will start seeking itself. However, your point is more around the grass. We put nitrogen on to boost feed when our farm system actually needs it. And the key to that is it's how you use that feed that defines whether you can keep clover there. If you're building up 2,800 to 3,000 covers, remember what I said, the trigger for white clover success is light. So if you can't do that if you're doing that on a regular basis, you're creating a lot of shading. Residuals also have a big impact on that. So you put nitrogen on, you grow some feed, but if you're maintaining residuals that are creating thatches in your pasture or building up mass in your pasture, the reality is you're not getting light into the rows or to the base. So that's that conflict. It's not that nitrogen kills clover, it's your management of your extra growth kills clover.
No, great point, because I think it means that they're not mutually exclusive. You can actually use small amounts of nitrogen and actually benefit your whole pasture.
I think what gets lost in the conversation, Juddy, is that the beauty of applied nitrogen is it's uniform. You define the rate that it goes on, and all plants need nitrogen to be nutritionally in a happy place. It's a macronutrient of importance for plants that includes clover, all grass species, and so uniformly fed pastures are healthy pastures. So people get selective about what is healthy, and natural nitrogen cycles are healthy for the clover. The grass doesn't get it in a uniform way, we have to remember, but the point still being is well-fed, strategically fed, and not overfed pastures are very nutritionally healthy.
Hey, pests. We've talked about clover, and we've actually talked about the grazing animal, which must be the greatest pest
It's a shocker,
but we make money out of that
Yes.
pest. What are the other common pests that we've got for we need to be looking out for white clover?
Oh, well, white clover has got a few, but in recent times it's been quite a dramatic pest that entered the country sometime in the 90s, and it's clover root weevil. It probably sat around the Bay of Plenty initially. I was part of the early phase of the education of the emergence of this pest. Like all biological introductions, you tend to find they hit critical masses and then they sort of move out in waves, and I don't know whether anyone can pinpoint exactly how long it was in the Bay of Plenty before it started moving, but it is a pest that arrived in the country without any natural predators, and it is the adult creates notches in the clover leaves, and its larvae chews off all the root hairs and all the nodules off the roots. And so if the larvae are continually taking the roots off the white clover plant, which doesn't have big fibrous root structures, it has fibrous root structures, but they're not what I describe as extensive, and those larvae are really stripping those roots off. As soon as you hit a summer condition, as soon as you get overgrazing, the plants are being yanked out of the ground, or they're losing all their water use efficiency and they're just shriveling up and dying. Because remember, white clover does like moisture, and if it's got no roots and it goes dry, it doesn't have moisture. So white clover root weevil, virtually every farmer, everyone listening who farms will have experienced it. It is ripped through the whole of the country over a period of about 15 years, from north to south, travelled on cows and moved south in big leaps after it started moving out of the Bay of Plenty into the Waikato. So this pest of white clover is definitive. Without its natural predators, in this case we've brought in a parasitic wasp that's been pretty successful in moderating its populations, but it was capable of destroying pastures.
Do you know where the little wasp came from?
I don't know, but I'm suspicious this one came from Ireland.
It did. It was out of Ireland.
Yeah.
So it's done a good job coming all that way. And
well, they don't have problems in Ireland, and maybe it's because they've got the whole family of pests there, parasites there. So that's probably the big one. But when it comes to things like establishment of white clover, direct drilling, which is very much seen as an environmentally useful establishment technique today, slugs are by far one of our biggest enemies of establishing white clover, and even fully established white clover, slugs can do a real job on them. Other bugs, grass grub. I remember live weight gain work on grass grub larvae, and white clover grows wonderful larvae. The live weight gain on white clover is exceptional. So, grass grub really target white clover roots. Piranha is quite effective at eating white clover as well. So it's got a myriad of pests that do interact with it. None of them is as damaging as the clover root weevil. Grass grub probably would sit at the next. We have clover flea in different parts of the country, which is a bit destructive and at times cosmetically damaging as well. So the point is there is a myriad of things. So we need to keep the environment in the favour of the white clover more often with good phosphate levels, good pHs.
Can you protect against some of these?
Seed coatings, there are definitely seed coatings that protect against some of them, without a doubt. But natural biocontrols are some of the big ones. Nothing protects against grass grub, piranha, and the clover root weevil's been sorted out by the parasitoid to a fair degree.
And these will be, some years they're bad, other years they're not so good.
Yeah.
Some regions are
correct.
Worse.
The clover root weevil being the biggie is this is the key, is it's a natural biological control, the parasitoid. So the reality is in any different year, the pest can get ahead of the parasitoid. So every now and then, even though it's well controlled throughout the country now, you can see whole paddocks being wiped out before the parasitoid catches up. So if you get a cold winter, for example, the wasp population may be behind, and as the weevil gets ahead in its population, strips out all the clover, the parasitoid's building its population behind it. So that's the thing about biocontrol. They're never at the front of the population, they're always growing behind it. So every now and then we'll get these storms, and unfortunately many of you will experience exactly that, and you'll lose paddocks of clover. Give it 12 months and many of them will recycle back with seed loadings, starting to re-establish, but it's always worth oversowing too to try and kick that off.
Listen, we're almost out of time. I've just got to run and shift some sheep. But I thought just before we go, we should actually just cover off what the Agricom white clover cultivars are. When I go down to my seed shop, I want to be able to ask, for my cultivars in a bit of a knowledgeable way. So maybe what we should do is go through them and then sort of highlight what sort of farming systems they would be useful for.
Well, it's pretty cool. My job is product development, so in a way these are my babies, and so with the breeders we sit there and review everything they create with time, and my job's really, at the end of the day, is to pick the varieties that are best fit for New Zealand farm systems, in my opinion, supported by the data of the breeding team and the evaluation teams. And we have an extensive evaluation program from Kerry all the way through the country under both sheep and beef and dairy. So we do review a lot of information. Probably looking at the medium to small at this stage, we've got a really nice product in Nomad white clover. It's probably sitting on the small side of medium. It's, for me personally, it's anyone who grazes set stocks in spring that they can chase a golf ball across the majority of their property for about a month. Nomad is the clover for you. And if you're forced into set stocking due to climatic conditions, or it's just part of your farming process and you are regularly finding your golf balls in paddocks, Nomad is the clover that should be the basis of your white clover selection. But we have two powerhouses emerging that are always good add-ons to a mixture where you might have Nomad as the base for that. But Tribute is New Zealand's largest selling white clover for the medium to large. It's because it goes pretty much in all mixes. It's capable of going to sheep country and dairy. We're in the phase of slowly moving towards replacing that, and to get that right, we've had to look for something pretty special. And Attribute is a new generation of medium to large leaf white clovers that is emerging in 2022. So we're pretty excited about its imminent release. Moving into the large category, which is where we describe them as the glory boys of the white clover world, because they are the big leaves, and you always go wow when you see them in action. But mainstay is pretty much our large leaf white clover. It's excelled in dairy country, particularly in summer dry dairy environments, and its recovery in autumn has always been very, very impressive. We are cycling that into the end of its life cycle and bringing out a product that is nothing but impressive. It's called Brace, and very much is even slightly larger in leaf size, and pretty much looking forward to that coming into our portfolio too. Really focused on things like cool season growth. Now that doesn't sound right when you grow majority of your feed in spring and summer with legumes. I didn't mention earlier, but the key to legumes is they only grow at about 20 degrees air temperature, and it's at that point they start to compete with grass. Many of our grasses are growing at around 18 degrees, so they have long periods of the calendar year where grasses have a stronger fit for growth than clover. But when it gets warm, the clovers really explode, and once you get those air temperatures, the leaf sizes really express themselves, and as soon as you hit your 20-degree days, something like Brace is just going to be impressive.
And so you'd put that in a finishing mix or a dairy mix?
Anything from a rotational, high fertility rotational graze finishing mix through to your dairy. And as I say, when you're in your finishing worlds, you're crossing over between rotational grazing and sheep and beef and lamb finishing. A tribute's going to be really the core of your decision, and then you're going down to nomad if you're slightly drier or you're slightly tougher on your grazing residuals, or you're going up to Brace and mainstay if you're heading into the dairy and beef environment.
Do you ever mix those?
Well, that's what I'm just describing. You do this crossover all the way.
So, but you could put 2 or maybe even 3 different clovers in a mix to try and take advantage of changes in environment?
Look, I'd be the first to tell you now that some of our breeders are extremely confident that you can actually make up a mix by just picking the right leaf size for your farm particular system of that landscape. The other attitude to it, and I agree with that to support the breeders and what they have achieved. These clovers are outstanding, and the reality is they can stand by themselves. They don't need to be in a mixture to be exceptional if you get your location right. However, the concept of mixing leaf sizes, remember what you described earlier is about these horizontal leaf planes. So white clover's got horizontal leaves, and the concept of mixing is about stacking horizontal leaves at different heights, which is giving you a bit more bulk density through your pasture mass. It's just not one plane, and so you tend to see that rotates throughout the calendar year, and you can sort of see there becomes a bit of depth to your clover production when you've got the different leaf sizes in your pasture.
I think the other thing there is that we're not just using our pastures, we're not just using them for one thing, and so therefore sometimes we do set stock them, and other times we are looking for a finishing feed. So having some of those different clovers in there kind of caters for those different jobs that our foragers are doing.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, I think it's I think we've run out of time. It's been a fascinating wander through the subject of white clover. I think there's a much more to it than some people think about. I think it's a white clover and that's it. But there's lots of facets to a white clover, and I think the point that you made earlier about the fact that given the new environment, the fact that we are now farming under some nitrogen caps, that the white clover is actually becoming one of the solutions to that, and is going to be more and more valuable, I think, as we move into these challenges.
Well, I'd say just to finish that is that we are already leaders in the use of white clover in the country, and this is this thing about retelling of stories. We are a world leader in grazing pastures full of white clover. What I probably would like to finish on is that we've taken it to a new level where actually our future production is almost dependent on its success, because it offers that much to our farm systems. So I would see it as a really nice way to conclude, Juddy, is that really getting our white clover right moving forward is a major part to maintaining the productivity in our farming landscape we enjoy today.
Thanks, Ellie. Right, off to shift my sheep.
Just before you go and shift your sheep, Juddy, I would just like to summarise a few of the take-home messages that we saw today.
And you must.
Yeah, I will, if you don't mind. But what we want to leave you with is just reminding you why white clover is really important to your farm system. And remember, in the past, it was very much about animal productivity. It is such a big deal for your animal performance, both in live weight gain and milk solids production. I do believe we shouldn't underestimate its role on pasture management. Pastures are more palatable when you've got good clover content, and that has big ramifications for the overall quality of your pasture. And the third thing, which has now become the first thing, is the nitrogen fixation associated with white clover, which we covered today. Remember that secret message: 1 kilogram of white clover growth is about 28 grams of nitrogen. You do have to grow a lot of white clover to get a lot of nitrogen, so that should be a key driver for everyone. I'll leave you with a couple of other key points. Remember your sowing depth, focusing on around 1 centimetre in a nice fine firm seed bed, and possibly with a little bit of seed broadcast on the ground. And always remember, light is the driver to white clover success. So the more you are shading your pasture, the harder you're going to find it is to maintain high white clover content. So remember, good grazing residuals, keeping a bit of light in your pasture, and white clover should flourish.
Thank you very much for sharing the last 40 minutes with us. Hope you learned something. And if you've got any questions, please contact your local Agricom person.
To the extent permitted by law, Agricom Limited provides no assurance, excludes liability, and limits any remaining liability to twice the amount received by it in relation to any information, product, or service it supplied.